Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for March 12th, 2021. And on this episode, I'm going to share with you what I see as the top 3 most successful nullification efforts in history. I'm just going to do a very brief overview of each, and I'm going to give you some links that you can check out if you want to learn more about each one in more detail. But then from there, I want to do something I think is far more important. I want to talk about one big thing that I see them as all having in common. And this is something that I think we really need to pay attention to today if we want to have effective strategy to advance liberty right now in our lifetime, but also to set the foundation for even more liberty in the years to come. First of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program, all the archives. I include a bunch of links and references on each individual episode so you can learn more on your own time. There's a bunch of different platforms. There's mainstream video ones, there's alternative video ones, there's live streaming, there's archive, and then of course the audio-only podcast edition. I appreciate all the reviews that have been coming in on Apple and some of the other platforms. It really helps us reach more people when you do that. Thank you very much. And then of course you can find our membership program where you can support us financially for as little as $2 a month. And we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. That show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And look, I couldn't be more grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you so much for being here. Whether it's your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, I can't say thank you enough. But since it's Fast Friday, I promise to not take up too much of your time, and let's see if I can get this info out to you in the next 10 to 15 minutes. So first of all, let's go through these 3. They're not in any particular order, but basically what I see is the most effective nullification efforts in history. And then we're going to get something that we can learn about them. And let's start out with this report from Mike Meharry last fall. 36 and counting more states are legalizing despite federal prohibition. The total number of states, Mike writes, defying federal cannabis prohibition is now 36. It could be higher pretty soon. That's a pun. And then on top of it, it's not just medical marijuana, which we saw start here in Southern California or in California back in 1996 with the passage of Prop 215, but has also expanded to recreational. So it started as one thing and then has grown and grown and grown. Again, all my puns are intended. We've got 15 recreational, 36 overall. We expect to see that number continue to advance and go further, despite the fact that every branch of the federal government says that this plant is illegal all the time. And even the Supreme Court in 2005 sided with the feds against the people of the several states. Now, I covered this story in some detail on an episode a couple of years ago, Winning Strategy for Liberty, the marijuana story and why it's important. And I think the summary here is pretty interesting. In modern times, there's probably no greater example of people, cities, and states doing something that the feds say is illegal than marijuana legalization. The story of nullification of cannabis prohibition from 1996 to today. So it's over 20 some odd years of this type of activity, this growth of this movement. And whether you're on board with weed or not, there's something to learn about strategy to move forward on whatever is important to you. I will link to that episode in the show notes. Please check it out when you have a chance. There's a lot of really interesting backstory that happens here. And this is how I summed it up basically back in a video in 2015. This from the script of it. Even in the face of increasing federal enforcement measures, a lot of people think that the feds just simply have kind of just brushed this off. But this is just a lie. This is propaganda. Each successive administration for many years really tried to ramp this up and tried to really shut down what the states were doing despite what the feds said that they could not do. It's just that at some point, someone recognized, like, look, we don't have the resources to handle all this. We're going to have to start being more targeted with how we do this. And that's the point where the tide really turned and the states have basically overwhelmed the feds or on the path to that. And that's how I said it in 2015. This was December 2015. Even in the face of increasing federal enforcement measures, the states, and I really should have said The people, the cities, and the states found the winning path. It's only a matter of time before they overwhelm federal enforcement capabilities completely, and the feds will have to act like they've decided to drop the issue just to save face. And we're pretty close to that happening right now. At some point in the very near future, we can expect to see the federal government either decriminalize or legalize or completely back off of the 36 plus states. But once that gets to 50, they've basically backed off everywhere. But I think they're going to try to legalize on a federal level so they don't have something to say, well, we lost. They'll say, we're protecting, we're being the good guys here. And that's how they're going to try to save face over time. But the fact of the matter is the states are winning and the feds are losing. So that's number one. Number two is the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, also to some degree of 1793. And I want to start out with something that I cited just recently in another episode, the Declaration of Immediate Causes, which induce and justify the secession of South Carolina from the federal union. This was from December of 1860. It came out right at the same time of their ordinance for secession, and they explained why they were doing what they were doing. The first half of the document talked about their view of the structure of the Union under the Constitution, and then they said, here's why we're out of here. And this is a great line to explain it. The states of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa, check this out, have enacted laws which either nullify the acts of Congress or render useless any attempt to execute them. So what was their complaint? Their number one complaint was that the northern states were nullifying the Federal Fugitive Slave Act, primarily through things called the personal liberty laws. They opted out of helping enforce them. In some areas, they got a little bit more aggressive, not much, but they basically frustrated the enforcement capability of the federal government, and it rendered them useless, rendered useless any attempt to execute them. And they went on and said, for 25 years, this agitation has been steadily increasing. So this was a 2+ decade, kind of like 1996 to today, 25 years of state-level resistance and defiance to the Fugitive Slave Act. I told that story in another episode back in September of 2019. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and nullification by northern states. I will link to that in the show notes. I encourage you to learn from that one as well, to check that out. Now, the third one that I want to cover. So first is cannabis prohibition. 2 is Federal Fugitive Slave Act. And number 3 is one I think most people don't even think of when it comes to nullification. And here, on December 5th, 1933, reading from another nullification success story, the 18th Amendment was repealed by the 21st Amendment, ending alcohol prohibition. But what most people don't know is that state and local nullification created the atmosphere where this repeal was inevitable. Wow, okay, nullification of alcohol prohibition. Those of you who are 10th Amendment Center geeks, you're already aware of this stuff. But a lot of people aren't aware of this history. We aren't taught this. We know that after the 18th Amendment went into effect, most of the states implemented laws or passed laws to implement federal enforcement prohibition or enforce the prohibition under the Volstead Act. So they implemented laws that said, okay, we're going to do the prohibition for the federal government. The state of Maryland, however, never passed any laws to enable state-level enforcement and was eventually joined by other states, starting with New York in 1923. This was written by Mike Meharry, and he says, a study from the University of Houston noted that states eventually grew tired of the hassle that came with enforcing the federal alcohol ban. And in fact, by 1925, just a few years into it really, by 1925, 6 states had developed laws that kept police from investigating infractions. You might be familiar with that strategy for the things that we push for today. Literally ban government agents on a state or a local level from participating or helping in the enforcement of the federal program. And this already happened in 6 states by 1925. Then you had cities in the Midwest and Northeast were particularly interested in assisting the feds with prohibition. And by 1928, 28 states had stopped funding for alcohol prohibition enforcement. Man, that sounds like nullification in practice and effect. But it isn't just me saying this. There was a report for Congress published in 1931, where the federal government recognized this in this report, that this refusal to cooperate was, in fact, nullification in practice. Here, this is an excerpt from a report issued by the National Commission on Law Observance and Enforcement, titled Report on the Enforcement of the Prohibition Laws of the United States. And here's how they sum it up. It is generally admitted, and indeed has been demonstrated by experience, that state cooperation is necessary to effective enforcement. Wow, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? And they go on, they said, it is substantially impracticable for the federal government alone to enforce the declared policy of the National Prohibition Act effectively as to home production. Obviously, they go on, nullification by failure of state cooperation, nullification by failure of state cooperation, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union was the advice that James Madison gave to individuals, cities, and states in Federalist 46 as a strategy to undermine and defeat federal programs, whether they were constitutional and bad policy, something you disagreed with, or something you saw as unconstitutional, a refusal to cooperate. And this is what they see. I don't think they cited Madison in this paper, but 1931, they're saying nullification, and it's obvious. Obviously, nullification by failure of state cooperation and acquiesced in nullification in homes have serious implications, of course, for the enforcement of the Volstead Act. So, but what do these three things have in common? Let's think about it. First of all, we have cannabis. People were growing, they were buying, they were selling, they were consuming this plant well before California voted for Prop 215 and legalized it for limited medical purposes. So it started out with people taking action first. The same goes for the Fugitive Slave Act. The first personal liberty laws really were in the 1820s, and they didn't get really effective until many years later, much more aggressive and more strategic. People were participating in all kinds of things, legal aid, mutual aid, the Underground Railroad. They didn't wait first for a state to pass a law and say, well, okay, now we're not going to participate, and then the individuals followed up. It's the other way around. Same with alcohol prohibition. And I want to go back to this page here where Mike Meharry writes, add to all this. So you're thinking 28 states stopped funding for alcohol prohibition, but that didn't start the process. People had already been doing stuff. He says, add to this the millions of individuals who flat out defied federal law. Prior to Prohibition, there were fewer than 15,000 legal bars in the U.S. And by 1927, more than 30,000 speakeasies were in business. So it doubled at the time that it was illegal. And approximately 100,000 people brewed alcohol illegally from home. And here's what Maryland's Senator Bruce said around that time. This is sometime late 1920s. He recognized what was happening. He said, even though national prohibition was in legal effect, quote, except to a highly qualified extent, it has never gone into practical effect at all. So again, what do these top three nullification efforts have in common? It's human action. The people acted first. They didn't first wait until a state or a locality passed a law or a resolution telling them that they had permission or that the state was on their side. No, they took action on something that was important to them, and they did it first. And then when it was popular enough in most situations, or was too difficult to oppose what was popular among the people, then states and localities started passing laws backing them up. Charles Carroll of Carrollton had a great quote that I think relates to this. And he put it this way. Let me pull this up on the screen so you can see it. He says, not a single instance can be selected from our history of a law favorable to liberty obtained from government, but by the unanimous, steady, and spirited conduct of the people. So it's human action first. It is spirited conduct of the people, unanimous, steady, fortitude, and perseverance, as Samuel Adams may have put it at one point as well. And really, at the end of the day, when enough people say no to the federal government, and then enough states and localities pass laws to back those people up, there's not much the feds can do to shove their so-called laws, regulations, or mandates down our throats. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. If you support the show, make sure to smash the like, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platforms. Leave comments in the archive, share links, all that stuff triggers the algorithm of the platforms and tells them to show the program to more people. Thank you for helping me out on that. And of course, if you want to put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.